The topic for this lecture is Microfinance and Sustainability, which I hope will be an enticement to read thoroughly the chapter that you're assigned for today. And what I want you to know by the end of this particular lecture is how microfinance can really support human development in families, individuals and families. And I also want you to know that microfinance has taken off as a concept and a tool. So even Whole Foods has a whole planet foundation that as you know, if you bring your own bags, you can either have a 10-cent credit off your grocery bill, or you can donate to the cause that they have going on for that week or that period of time. So microfinance is an effective tool that can be used to combat poverty and malnutrition and a whole variety of other problems. So here's the short story, and I hope that you will dive into the longer story. So the chapter in the book about microfinance, Hope's Edge, is about Bangladesh, and it is a country that's often cited as being high in poverty, so 700 children dying per day of malnutrition-related diseases. Now, realize that this was at the time that your book was written, but most of the information is still accurate. So, for example, lots of food grows there, but it's not just a basket case. It emerged from colonial rule and then a war of independence and flooding. So the flooding is part of some failed interventions. Westerners created dams and embankments that made the problem worse. And so this is an example of how sometimes what Westerners think of as solutions to problems, or when you look at a particular locality and only see the problems with that locality rather than the strengths, and looking for solutions in place, that can cause more problems or unintended consequences. So Bangladesh is a place where people in the West think of people starving and being helpless, but there are a lot of strengths in Bangladesh that you'll be reading about. And so even at the time, under British rule in 1943, as you can see, 3 million people starved while the warehouses overflowed with grain, and there is poverty that threatens health and life. And poverty is about being excluded, about being less than human, whether you're talking about Bangladesh or you're talking about the United States. But the more that norms change, the less acceptable it is to exclude others. So think about the lunch, the People's Restaurant in Belo Horizonte, that everyone ate together. So even those who were living in economic poverty were not excluded. And so think about the social dimensions of poverty, not just the economic dimensions of poverty, and what that means for children and for families. So the Grameen Bank is a very successful endeavor. It was founded in 1976. So Professor Yunus, he loaned $27 of his own to 42 people. And you'll have to read about how he was inspired to do this. But they all paid it back. He was willing to take a chance and take a risk that he wasn't going to get any of it back. But he got it all back. And when he went to a bank to try to convince a bank to create a program modeled after what he was doing, they wanted further proof of creditworthiness, because these are people who don't have credit. One of the things that you'll learn in the reading is that only 2% of people in the world are eligible for credit. You are part of that 2%. So the banks never did believe him, but he replicated the process again and again successfully, and now it's a business with more than 10,000 employees. Again, this is 2003 figures, so 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, and 2.4 million borrowers, a successful model. So he had to drop all preconceptions. So preconceptions like if you give people money, they're not going to use it well, or they don't have the wherewithal to use it well, or they'll waste it. But he had to drop his preconditions and ask really, why is it this way and why can't it be different? So with his first experience loaning the $27, he knew each person individually, and he realized that they needed money to invest in the tools of production. So here in the United States, we think about tools of production on the order of, loans in the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. But sometimes tools of production are a very small amount of money. It doesn't take a lot to get people going and to leverage that. So when he loaned people money, in the even small amounts of money, it liberated them from money lenders. And so compare this to payday lenders in the United States. I'm sure that you are aware of the fact that people who go to payday lenders are desperate and that the terms are awful. They are legal but not ethical or moral in any sense of the word, because it's very difficult for people to get out from underneath the interest, the penalties, the different charges that payday lenders can charge. And so this is a service that wasn't available in their communities, that gave them the resources they needed to be able to get started in business. And that might be to buy some chickens, it may be to get some tools or seeds, but in any case that this was very successful. So one of the things that I want you to think about from here on out and for the rest of your entire life is that every economic transaction is a relationship. So Professor Yunus knew personally all of the original people that he loaned money to, but anytime you buy anything, anytime you borrow money, every single purchase you make, whether it's food, clothing, energy, it is a transaction, it's a relationship. You have a relationship with another person, and how you carry out that transaction communicates something about that relationship. So by 2003, the Grameen Bank had been replicated in at least 58 countries. And as I mentioned, Whole Foods has a foundation that will work with microfinancing. And even the U.S. Department of Agriculture has microfinance loans now, although it's a different scale. So they may be in quantities of $25,000 to $50,000 for people who are otherwise unable to get financing, and for specific things like hay storage, for example. And they have, as I mentioned, these over 10,000 employees, millions of borrowers, and Muhammad Yunus was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for the project because it was so successful. And so this is just another call to question things as the way they are, and to really be able to open our frame of reference to how things could be. And so, asking the question, well, shouldn't the very fact that hunger and poverty exist make us question all our wisdom? It doesn't have to be this way. And he is an example of someone who's willing to go out on a limb and take a risk to say maybe things could be different. So typically, read about how things are typically organized in a banking system. And what he did was flipped it on his head so that the deciders, the people who decide who can get a loan, are the actual borrowers. It's a participatory organization, very much more like a credit union, if you're familiar with that concept, than a bank. The guarantors, the security is trust among the borrowers rather than material collateral. So they are co-responsible for the loans. Again, this is about relationships. The owners are almost entirely the members or borrowers, very much like a credit union. And they elect directors among themselves who attend board meetings 4 times a year. There are no secrets. All discussions are public. And the motives are mixed, eliminating poverty and making a profit. You have to make a profit in order to be sustainable. But that doesn't have to be your own bottom line. So rather than having a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, it is about eliminating poverty of the members and borrowers. Another key difference is that the Grameen Bank goes into the community rather than people going to the bank with their hat in their hands. So in addition to financially working to end poverty, Yunus and his colleagues learned that progress requires more than money lending. So microcredit was the entry point, and this is a concept I want you to take with you as well. How do you enter into a system and think about ways to have a ripple effect to make change in a system as an entry point or a leverage point. So microcredit was the entry point, and it brought immediate relief and built relationships and trust, and it got people on their feet. But the 16 decisions were developed in 1984 out of long discussions with the borrowers themselves. So this wasn't a top-down process where Yunus decided, well, if you're going to borrow money, you have to do these 16 things. It was the borrowers who really came up with these principles. And think about this as explicitly making some expectations very visible, as opposed to implicit. We have implicit assumptions in our culture. So, for example, make as much money as you can and spend as much money as possible. So, think about playing the game Monopoly. If it doesn't take very many times of playing Monopoly before you realize how the game works and how there's a tipping point when it's clearly evident who's going to win and who's going to lose, and there's really no way to reverse that. And also think about what kinds of values are conveyed and lived out. So every bank has ethical and moral consequences for the people who work with them. But to make that explicit and to work with people to make that explicit. So this may seem really, really out of the box, but among the 16 decisions are pledges to keep the family small. And keep in mind, it's not as though people are denied the ability to borrow money if they don't keep the 16 decisions. But borrowers are 50% more likely to use family planning. And this is in an attempt to help them to manage their financial sustainability. There are many reasons why fertility is higher in developing countries, but among those reasons are that infant mortality is high. And so you have a cycle. Higher fertility means higher infant mortality. If you decrease fertility, you have a greater likelihood of decreasing infant mortality and maintaining child health as well. We shall not inflict any injustice on anyone, neither shall we allow anyone to do so. And there's a great example in the chapter about how the members stood up for someone whose rights were violated. We shall not take any dowry into our sons' weddings, neither shall we give any dowry in our daughters' weddings. We shall keep the center free from the curse of the dowry. And you're going to need to read and really think about why a dowry would be considered a curse. When they were asked if they were following the decisions, the answer is, we're trying, but we're not all the way there yet. And you could say that about any sort of principled decision-making processes. So the values of Green are embedded in the norms it encourages and in the new businesses it spawns. So the 17th decision, which was suggested by Francis, was a living wage. And Eunice pointed out that it's already inherent in we should not do any wrong to others, and we should not tolerate any wrongs to others. In other words, it is a wrong to employ someone and not pay them a living wage, basically trading their 40 hours of labor, skills, and time for a compensation that won't allow them to live, to have a livelihood. So think about, how does taking care of employees promote sustainability, both for the employees and for the business? Gender is also an important factor. So why is that important? Why are housing loans given to women rather than men? Well, for one thing, then it's harder for husbands to divorce them. And Eunice recognizes that this is a structural factor in Bangladesh society. Half the murders in Bangladesh are women killed by their husbands. And the quote, you can always get a new wife because they're considered property or objects rather than people. And so this is a strategy put in place to provide some protection to women. At that time, there were 200 acid burn victims, and this is throwing acid in their faces, and that would make them undesirable wives for others as well. And it has to do with economic decisions, but it's much more. It's about changing norms and changing what is acceptable, ensuring that women are equally included, and that women's rights are not just about justice for women, they're at the very heart of societal development. And he said, no society can become healthy as long as half the population is treated as less than human. The loss is for the whole society. You'll note that they don't hang neem branches when daughters are born. When sons are born, neem branches are hung over the doorway, and it's a celebration of life. Grameen has had some difficulty hiring and retaining women employees because of the disapproval of women traveling alone in the countryside. But part of the challenge is to give women voices, to overcome and unlearn the lessons of not speaking. Another example of this is that fish culture in Bangladesh is considered not appropriate for women. In other words, farming and fishing, or farming fish and fishing. And so one of the women who engaged in fish culture was told, "You're working like a man. If you join with Grameen, you are not part of our culture." So being ostracized or being separated is a pretty powerful disincentive. But then other women saw that the woman who was engaging in fish culture had food, clothes, was eating 3 times a day, and able to send their children to school. So then they wanted to join. Think of this as the early adopters of a new social movement or a new norm. So, and that's how the dynamics go. There are always early adopters, and then there are those who sort of, hang by the wayside until they see how things are going to turn out. But when it was apparent that fish culture was helping women to sustain and support their families, then that changed. So they were slower to warm up and then joined. So I wanted you to see a picture of Muhammad Yunus because I think that it becomes more memorable. And then the quote from page 120, "No society can become healthy as long as half the population is treated as less than human." And so think about this about any aspect of human rights or any sector of society, that if any of our rights are violated, that all of our rights are violated. So Yunus was asked, how did you identify leaders? And the surprising answer was that they just happened to be around. He said that leaders were made, not chosen. And this is the strengths approach. And you may be familiar with the strengths approach if any of you are involved with the Nebraska Human Resource Initiative, NHRI, which has been around here at UNL for about 50 years. Or with Gallup, which also takes a strengths approach, or the family strengths theory. In other words, the assumption that everyone has strengths, that the goal is to identify and grow those strengths and to help others find their strengths. And an assumption that at their core, people are good and that they want to realize those strengths. They get pleasure from being honest. They get pleasure from doing good things. And this is very similar to what Francis and Anna talk about at the beginning of the book, where, the basic human needs to connect, to be effective, and to relate to other people, to make a difference in their lives and to make a difference in the world. So being involved with the Grameen Bank gave people an opportunity to do all of these things, to connect with other people, to make a difference, to express their creativity. I liked the metaphor of people being like bonsai trees. If you put them in a small pot, they don't grow much. And so think about society as the pot. How does society limit people? But if you put them in a big pot, they can grow bigger. And so think about that metaphor about what size pot are we putting people in what parts of our society. And think about the character. They have, at that time, 1,000 staff. They carried lots of cash, and they'd never had a theft by an employee. So think about building loyalty and trust between employers and employees. And what Yunus had to say about that is, that people do get pleasure from being honest, but then opportunities come, temptations come, or things are done in such a sloppy way that people feel that, well, why don't I do it? What difference will it make? So they become dishonest. So think about how honesty and dishonesty might be part of a system as much as part of a person. So another business, there's a story of the Madras checkcloth. It's really a pretty fascinating story. And when you read that, these are people who are paid a living wage. And when the person who runs that business was asked, couldn't you pay them less? He said, I could, but don't we all want to live happy? My laborers would not be happy if I paid them less. Now I see my workers putting tin roofs on their houses, and I feel proud. And so that reminded me of a film that some of you might have seen, but if you haven't, you're going to need to take the time to watch this movie at some point in time.
What does that get us? A discontented, lazy rabble instead of a thrifty working class. And all because a few starry-eyed dreamers like Peter Bailey stir 'em up and fill their head with a lot of impossible ideas. Now, I say...
Just a minute now. Hold on, Mr. Just a minute. Now, you're right when you say my father was no businessman. I know that. Why he ever started this cheap penny-ante building and loan, I'll never know. But neither you nor anybody else can say anything against his character, because his whole life was, why, in the 25 years since he and Uncle Billy started this thing, he never once thought of himself. Isn't that right, Uncle Billy? He didn't save enough money to send Harry to school, let alone me. But he did help a few people get out of your slums, Mr. Potter. And what's wrong with that? Well, here, you're all businessmen here. Doesn't it make them better citizens? Doesn't it make them better customers? You said that what'd you say just a minute ago? They had to wait and save their money before they even thought of a decent home? Wait for what? Until their children grow up and leave them? Until they're so old and broken down that do you know how long it takes a working man to save $5,000? Just remember this, Mr. Potter, that this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this community. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so. People were human beings to him, but to you, a warped, frustrated old man, they're cattle. Well, in my book, he died a much richer man than you'll ever be.
I'm not interested in your book. I'm talking about the building and loan.
I know very well what you're talking about. You're talking about something you can't get your fingers on, and it's galling you. That's what you're talking about, I know. Well, I've said too much. You're the board here. You do what you want with this thing. There's just one thing more, though. This town needs this measly one-horse institution, if only to have some place where people can come without crawling to Potter. Come on.
Okay, so think about not that. Sorry. So think about whether you have a philosophy about human nature that is more like Mr. Potter, or if your philosophy of human nature is more like that of George Bailey. So the Grameen Bank was so successful that it also spawned the Securities and Management Company, which is an investment company that owns shares in the Grameen family companies. It involves socially responsible investing. So more than $2 trillion of American investors, not in Grameen specifically, but in the socially responsible companies that are associated by it. And you'll note that there is a quote on page 134. The world has always visualized capitalism by saying the driving force is greed, but Grameen is a capitalist institution. But you can't say greed is moving this bank. Our social objectives are. So the theory needs a big reinterpretation. Social consciousness can be just as powerful a driving force for capitalism as greed. We must put this social consciousness to work. So one thing that I want you to take away from this as well is that a lot of times when alternative institutions are proposed, it's assumed that people who are interested in lifting up the poor or helping the poor are anti-capitalist. Or when people talk about redistribution of wealth, it's assumed that they're anti-capitalist. And that's not necessarily the case. This is a capitalist institution, and it is a capitalist institution with a social consciousness. And so there is a lot of writing on natural capitalism or socially conscious capitalism. And you may want to do a little search on that because it's pretty interesting, but a different philosophy, because it questions the fundamental assumption that people are always going to be driven by greed and self-interest. And in fact, happiness research disproves the fact that greed and accumulation of wealth in itself makes people happy, but rather helping others is a much bigger reward for humans. It's very important for us. It's part of how we are put together. So social consciousness and helping others is something that is most fulfilling in people's lives. Even neuroscience provides good evidence to this, that people are happier when they have the opportunity to help others. So they use the metaphor of the hyacinth principles. Sharing ideas, seeds, and knowledge. It's not a top-down approach. They don't go and tell people what to do. Instead, they send out shoots that sprout, and then the new plant sends out shoots, and farmers are teaching farmers. This is a model that can be replicated throughout the world. The philosophy or the essence is continuing to listen to the people themselves and to innovate in response to specific circumstances. So to push assumptions, there's not a cookie cutter formula. It's different in different places. And so they have to experiment with what works best in a certain context. So think about context as ecosystem or culture. And so the hyacinth cannot spread a rigid formula, but rather it's a liberating philosophy. In some ways, it can be considered an invasive species. The caution is that, like a plant, no idea can be transferred wholesale from one place to another. To learn from one another, we must discover the essence of the other's experience. Otherwise, it might become an invasive species if it's just transplanted the same way everywhere. Gramine is also not a product, it's a process of listening, of continual renewal by commitment to one precept, which is what is not what has to be. And they're not stuck with a status quo. So I hope that you will think about the big picture, interactions between microsystems, exosystems, macrosystems, and big ideas, that there are many possible solutions. Solutions must fit to the location and the context, and think about what our assumptions are about human nature and about how social relationships operate in economic transactions. And I also hope that you enjoy the chapters.